Yeah. Okay. Hi, Johannes. Can you hear me well?
Hey, I can hear you very well. Can you hear me as well?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect.
Hi, Johannes. You hear me?
I hear you, Patrick. Hello.
Okay, great. Hello. So we'll start, okay, in 1 minute. And Tarane, yeah, okay. So Tarane will be the president of the jury, okay?
Yeah.
So she will organize everything. And, okay. So
Perfect.
can we start?
Should we start?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Then thank you, Patrick. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. So then, thank you, everyone. I'm Tarana Sayedi. I have the honor of being the president of this jury who will be evaluating the defense of Louis. So I will start by presenting the jury members. And then we're going to continue with the presentation from Louis. And then after that, we will move to the questions from starting with the referees and then moving on to the examiners and comments from the supervisors. And at that point, then we will close the session, do the deliberation, and we will come back to you guys with the decision and our report on the defense. The jury is composed of two referees, Professor Amaury Habrach from University Jean Monnet, Saint-Étienne, and also Alexandros Kalousis, professor at University of Applied Sciences in Western Switzerland. And then there are two examiners, Johannes Brandstetter, from a professor at Johannes Kepler University in Leeds, and myself, Tarane Sayadi, professor at Conservatoire National Arts et Métiers, and also the two supervisors of the thesis, Professor Patrick Canineri and Jean-Noël Vito from Sorbonne University. With that, Louis, please, you have the floor. You can start with your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And good afternoon, and thank you all for being here for my PhD defense. I'm pleased to present today my PhD thesis titled Operator Learning for Modeling Spatial Temporal Dynamics from PDEs. This work has been supervised by Professors Patrick Canineri and Jean-Noël Vito. And I will start first by providing some background and some motivations to help contextualize the work. And then I will go over a set of 3 different contributions of the thesis. And then I will conclude with the discussion and some perspectives for future work. In this thesis, we are going to address spatial temporal dynamics that can arise in physical systems. And these spatial temporal dynamics are typically described by a set of partial differential equations. And these partial differential equations provide an implicit modeling of the evolution of the physical system over space and time. To illustrate, I've selected 2 examples. So here at the top, we have the weather forecasting example, where you can model the dynamics of the weather by a set of equations, including the Navier-Stokes equation. And by solving this equation, you can obtain a forecast of the weather. Similarly, here with the car, you can model the airflow around it through a Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equation. And solving this equation lets you compute the pressure forces at the surface of the car, which is useful for aerodynamics. However, these equations lack analytical solutions, and therefore it is required to obtain solutions through the use of numerical solvers. These numerical solvers essentially rely on spatial and temporal discretization, and incorporate a range of techniques that have been developed over the years by physicists and engineers. These techniques include finite differences, finite elements for the spatial components, and for the temporal part, we use explicit or implicit schemes. Overall, these techniques have good properties. They can be analyzed under the scope of different criteria. However, there is a general trade-off between the accuracy of the solution that you obtain from the solver and the computational cost required to obtain it. To get some perspective of this cost, we can get back to the two examples. So for the weather forecasting example, to obtain a prediction over the course of 15 days, you will require 15 minutes parallelized across 8,000 calls, according to some sources, Weather Bench 2. And for the car example, so solving the Grant's equation takes about 24 minutes parallelized across 512 calls. So this means that these techniques come at a cost. On the other hand, deep learning offers an alternative to explicit modeling by learning the spatial temporal dynamics directly from data. And to illustrate this capacity, a good example is by having a look at the recent advancements in the weather forecasting here on the left part of the slide, where I have listed a series of models that have been able to match the accuracy of traditional numerical solvers on the weather forecasting task. If we have a look at the first one to understand, so GraphCast, that was released by Google in 2022, is a large neural network that has been trained on vast amounts of historical weather data. And at inference, here on the right, it works as follows. It takes the current input weather state, and it also takes the weather state 6 hours earlier. And what the model gives you back is the prediction of the weather state 6 hours into the future. To obtain the forecast over the 15 days, you can apply this model repeatedly or autoregressively to complete the trajectory. Overall, GraphCast, you can see here on the table that it is 50 times faster to obtain the forecast than the traditional solver, and it requires only 1 CPU GPU against 8,000 CPU cores. This means that overall, this framework, this paradigm, could enable modeling spatial temporal dynamics forecasting with a cost-effective manner. There has been several attempts to model partial differential equations with deep learning, and we can organize the different approaches along these two axes plot. So in the vertical axis, you have the amount of physical prior knowledge that is given to the system as input in order to learn the spatial temporal dynamics. And on the right here, you have the amount of data that is given to train the neural networks. So if we start by the neural solvers, these are methods that do not observe data or very little, but they actually use all the explicit modeling parameters of the partial differential equations. So you can provide the equation as input, the parameters, etc. Here in the middle, you have a set of models that rely on the traditional numerical solvers, but which are augmented with a deep learning component. This deep learning component requires data for training it, and therefore it's in the middle here and in the middle here. And here today, we are going to focus on neural surrogates, which are data-intensive approach, but which do not require any explicit physical prior knowledge of the system. And these neural surrogates include, for instance, neural operators, and they also include most of the weather forecast models that I showed earlier, including GraphCast or Aurora, for instance. In this work, we consider spatial temporal dynamics that can be described by this system of equations. So this is the explicit modeling of such dynamics, where you have three equations. So the equation here at the top is the partial differential equation. The equation here in the middle is the initial condition, and here it's the boundary condition. In the governing equation, here in the partial differential equation, this models the evolution of the system U over the space and time, and it includes temporal derivatives and spatial derivatives, and it also includes a set of coefficients or forcing terms. These coefficients, for instance, can be viscosity parameters or advection speed, and here the forcing terms represent external input to the system. The initial condition here specifies the initial state of the system, and the boundary condition specifies how the system behaves at the boundaries. And in order to train a neural surrogate that is able to emulate special temporal dynamics that can be described by such equations, we usually have access to a training dataset of n trajectories, where the time evolution goes from left to right. And these trajectories are snapshots of systems that follow the underlying dynamics that can be described by the PDEs. But what is important to note here is that when we train the surrogate model on this data, we never give it access to the explicit equations or the explicit modeling here. It must infer the correct spatial temporal dynamics through data alone. And this is a change in setting, which causes several generalization changes. So first, typical neural surrogates are trained to generalize to new initial conditions. This means that here the model will receive a new state as the initial condition here changes. And in order to generalize to these settings, the different trajectories that you see during the training have different initial conditions. So the initial condition is the main varying parameters. And this is the classical setting. In this work, we are going to consider two additional set of challenges. The first one is that we consider scenarios where the grid or the domain can change between the training and the test. This can take the form, for instance, of an input that is observed through a sparse grid. As the grid is sparse, some information can be missing in the initial state, and therefore it is a challenging task to unroll the dynamics of time given this input. The second scenario that we consider here is the changes in the domain omega, which means, for instance, that you can have a cylinder within a fluid, and the location of the cylinder and the shape of the cylinder will affect how the fluid behaves around it. The second challenge that we want to tackle is the generalization to new PDE parameters. Here, by PDE parameters, we mean PDE coefficients, forcing terms F, and different boundary conditions. And each of these parameters has a large influence on the dynamics. And to illustrate, I have shown here examples of a trajectory from the velocity equation, which can be influenced by the viscosity parameter. And when the viscosity is high, the fluid has a laminar structure. And when the viscosity is low, the fluid has a more turbulent behavior. And this helps illustrate the difficulty of the task to have a neural surrogate that generalizes across these different coefficients and parameters. In this thesis, we mainly tackle these two different axes of generalization. So first, we want to have a neural surrogate that is able to change to take as input change an input that receives that is robust to the discretization and the domain, and we want to have a neural surrogate that is robust to the changes in the PDE parameters. To tackle the first challenge, we propose two frameworks. The first one, Coral, is an operator learning framework that leverages neural fields. The second one, Aroma, is also tackling operator learning, but leverages this time transformers. And in the third example, in the third contribution, we propose an in-context learning framework for surrogate modeling on partial differential equations inspired by large language models. So let's start with the first contribution, operator learning with neural fields. operator learning is essentially an extension of supervised learning to functional input and output. This means that the operator that we want to learn now maps a function to another one. And in this contribution, we took 3 different tasks as a support. So the first one is the direct forecasting task, where the operator goes from U0 to UT, which is the steady state of the system. The second task is to learn an operator G theta that can time step the system by delta t, so it can go from UT to UT plus delta t. And finally, the last task that we consider is a geometry aware inference task, where G theta is trained to map a function characterizing the geometry to a steady state solution. However, in practice, these functions are discretized, and our objective with this contribution is to propose an operator that is robust to the discretization and that returns a function as output. This means that the operator G theta should be able to handle sparse grid or coarse grid. This should have a minimal impact on the operator and on the prediction. This is the first requirement. And the second requirement is that the operator should output a function, and this function could be queried anywhere within the domain. For instance, if we have a coarse grid as input, characterizing UT, so the state of the system at time t, the operator learns to time step the system at time t plus delta t, and then we can query the function at each coordinate x within the domain, thereby recovering the dense grid. So the initial developments of neural operators that were proposed cannot actually handle these settings. So DeepNet here on the left is an architecture that works like as follows. It is composed of 2 networks, a trunk net and a branch net. The trunk net takes as input a spatial coordinate y and produces a set of basis function. And then the branch net takes as input a set of sensors values. These sensors values then produce a set of coefficients, which together combined with the output of the trunk net, it outputs the prediction at the corresponding location. This means that overall, DeepNet can query the output function anywhere within the domain, but is not robust to the discretization, as the change in sensor locations would not be compatible with this type of architecture. The second neural operator that we consider here is the Fourier neural operator, which essentially operates in the Fourier domain. To perform the computation to go from the physical space to the spectral space, it uses the fast Fourier transform algorithm in practice. This means that it is not possible to use irregular grids with this architecture, and therefore it is not robust to the discretization. Similarly, when FNO processes an input state to produce an output, it processes all the values all together and is not able to query the output function anywhere within the domain. So our idea within the contribution is to propose to process observations as a point set using neural network. And so we want to process discrete data as a realization of a function. And this function is parameterized by a so-called neural field. A neural field takes as input coordinate x and outputs some value. And to illustrate this, I have taken an image of a dog. So here, the neural field has been trained to represent this dog image. And by querying independently each coordinate x, we recover the corresponding RGB values at each position, thereby reconstructing the dog image. What is interesting with this approach is that the weight theta of the neural network provides a functional encoding of the image. And because we have parameterized this as a function, we can query anywhere within the domain the corresponding function. This means that we can perform hyper resolution or we can perform interpolation. To obtain this set of weight theta, we formulate an inverse problem. This inverse problem minimizes the L2 reconstruction error between the neural fields output, F theta, and the corresponding observed pixel. And this is typically achieved by gradient-based optimization. So over the course of optimization, the neural field reconstruction gets sharper and sharper and starts to look like the dog image. And what's key here to understand is that the optimization here works with irregular point sets. It is not dependent on a mesh or on a grid. It can work directly on point sets, which satisfies our second requirement for the operator learning framework that we want to propose. In particular, in order to be able to represent high-frequency details in the PDE solutions, we incorporating in our neural field sinusoidal activations. So to illustrate the effect of this sinusoidal activation, I've taken the same ground truth image, and then I've tried to perform the optimization that we saw earlier in order to reconstruct as closely as possible this image. For this, we benchmark different architectures. So a neural network with 10 niche activations with ReLU, ReLU plus positional embedding, which are defined here, the sum of sines and cosines with different frequencies. And here is the Serrano architecture that uses sinusoidal activations. And we can clearly see that when using classical activation functions such as 10H or ReLU, the neural network is not able to recover the high-frequency components of the image. And we therefore stick with the Serrano architecture for our neural fields. Furthermore, as we are interested in learning an operator between an input function and an output function, we need to be able to represent a family of input and output functions, whereas earlier it was only a single function that was represented by the neural network. Therefore, here we introduce conditioning mechanism to the neural field in order to be able to adapt the reconstruction to each specific instance. Specifically, this hypernetwork, specifically this conditioning mechanism is achieved by a hypernetwork. This hypernetwork takes as input an instance-specific code and produces a set of biases inside the neural network. These lets adapt the reconstruction for each instances of code. So by changing the code, it changes the reconstruction. The weights theta of the neural fields here are shared between all the instances, and as well the weights of the hypernetwork are shared also across the instances. And in practice, we have used a hypernetwork that was linear. So here, Z is the input, and VL and CL are the parameters of the hypernetwork. To learn the code for a given image, we solve an inverse problem using auto-decoding in order to benefit to the same robustness to the grid. So we simply set the code to 0 and then solve the optimization problem by changing the instance-specific code. And in order to accelerate this inference, we train the model with a meta-learning strategy. This means that during training, there is a double loop, one loop of optimization over the instance codes, and one loop of optimization over the weights of the neural field and hypernetwork. And with this meta-learning objective, we enforce the model to solve the auto-decoding task in a few steps. So now we have all the ingredients to introduce our framework, Coral, which is an encode, process, decode framework. And so at inference, Coral is able to take as input a function discretized over a point set. This auto-decoding that we introduce produces an input latent code, ZA, and then this input latent code, ZA, is processed by an MLP in order to forecast or make a prediction in the latent space. We then use our neural latent modulated neural field to query, to decode this output code and to query it anywhere within the domain. And for training, we splitted the training in 2 phases. In the first training, we trained the neural field to auto-decode and then decode the observations. And in the second stage, we fix the input latent code and the output latent code, and we perform the mapping in the latent space. And we train the processor to perform this mapping. Here are two sets of results, qualitative results. So you can see here on the left that Coral takes as input here, in this case, this Euler equation around the macro. It takes as input a mesh that characterizes the shape of the airfoil, and then it produces an output that closely matches the ground truth for different new shapes. Here on this part, in which Coral is trained on the dynamics modeling task on the spherical shallow water equation, we have trained Coral on a dense grid where everything was observable. And then we challenged the model at test time by subsampling this grid into partial observation here, so 20% and 5% of the points are selected. And then we provide Coral with an initial condition that is only observed at these subsample grids. So this means that only a partial input is provided to the system. On each corresponding row, you can see the forecast of Coral over time. And here, what is remarkable is that 20%, it's still able to faithfully unroll the dynamics over time, despite having access to only 20% of the initial state. Overall, so we have introduced in this contribution Coral, which is a point set approach for operator learning, and it's able to handle different tasks. However, we have identified two key bottlenecks. So the first one is the meta-learning training strategy that will be expensive during training and long during training. And also, we've seen that encoding all the functions observations into a single latent code with our approach was a strong assumption on the dynamics. And we will see in the second contribution with Aroma how we can solve these two issues. Let's now switch to operator learning with transformers. So essentially in this contribution in Aroma, we propose a framework to increase the exclusivity of encode process decode models by leveraging transformers. This means that as we have identified that Coral could struggle with turbulent dynamics, we do not process the latent dynamics with an MLP, but here with a processor that takes the form of a transformer architecture. This transformer architecture takes as input a sequence of tokens that represents the current state, and it predicts another sequence of tokens that represents the next state of the trajectory. And in Aroma, we want to keep the same two properties that we introduced with Coral, which was the robustness to the discretization and the ability to query the output function anywhere within the domain. So in order to achieve this, we modify the encoding and decoding stage with cross-attention blocks. Specifically, here the encoder relies on a cross-attention block to perform a mapping from a set of endpoints here, which could be arbitrary, onto a fixed number of M tokens. And as we use a cross-attention, this is actually flexible with respect to the choice of discretization. Regarding the second property, we also use a cross-attention block here at the decoding phase, which is able to map a query coordinate x to the corresponding value here at the top. Let's now see the encoder's architecture in more details. So at the encoding stage, we actually perform two cross-attentions to encode two different kinds of knowledge. So here in the first cross-attention, we create queries from learnable tokens that can encode prior spatial knowledge of the system. And we create keys and values from coordinate embeddings of a particular geometry, a particular input. And this cross-attention enables to adapt the tokens to the geometry of the system. So this means that T0 here is now aware of the geometry. So this means that it knows where the cylinder is at within the domain, essentially. And at the second cross-attention stage, we create queries from these geometry-aware tokens, keys from the coordinate embedding of the system, and values from the pixels or function values of the input function. So this means that here in TOPS, we have aggregated the function values in a manner that is robust to the discretization. And we subsequently reduce the channel dimension in order to facilitate the task of the processor. We have verified experimentally what each token here at this cross-attention was attending to. So for instance, the first token here, this one, token 1, has a high cross-attention score for this region of space. And so this means that the token Z1 that corresponds to it will aggregate the values from these positions. And similarly for token 3, which is there, this region of space, and this means that Z3 will aggregate the values that are observed with, at this location. Regarding the decoder, it follows a similar structure, and it also relies on a cross-attention mechanism, where the query is formed by a frequency embedding of the coordinate, and keys or values are produced from these M processed tokens. And this outputs a feature vector f of x that is further refined, further processed by an MLP here to output the reconstruction. We have done a similar analysis here this time on the 1D Burgers equation. So this is the spatial axis, and this is the axis of the function. And the blue is the initial state, and red is the furthest advanced state. So it's the temporal dimension. And what we have done here is that we have slightly changed each token here independently and observed what region of space were affected by this change. And therefore, this means that, for instance, token M here will represent, will affect the reconstruction in this region. Therefore, the tokens represent preserve a spatial structure. Regarding the training of the processor, so it operates in the latent space, as was done in Coral, and it uses a transformer architecture. So at inference, what we do is that we take the current latent token and a noisy estimate of the next state. And initially, this is a pure random noise, but the latent refiner is able to process it and to gradually remove the noise that was present in it to perform the prediction. And for training, well, we simply took the current latent token and the noisy version of the next latent token and tried to remove the noise that was injected into it. We mainly chose two different settings. The first setting is on datasets with regular grids, with equations with low viscosity or that could include shocks. And we also did experiments on datasets where there are obstacles within the domain, such as cylinder and Eiffel flow. And the general training task is to go to UT plus delta T from UT. And at test time, we unroll the dynamics from U0 to a given horizon. So the table on the left is the is the evaluation on the dataset with regular grids. And so we have compared our method with regular grid-based baselines, neural field baselines, and transformers that operate in the original physical space. And we can see from this table that aroma here is on par with the methods that are supposed to work well on regular grids. So this is a good sign. And it outperforms so Dino and Coral, which are neural fields methods. And we think that because of the bottleneck that these architectures have in their design. And regarding GNOT and Operamer, they operate in the physical space with a linear attention and could potentially be less expressive than ARMA here in this case. And on this experiment here, this is the two data sets that consider, so this sign of what flow that have cycles within the domain. And for this, we found that the architecture of Arna was really well designed for this type of task, as it was outperforming all the other baselines by a large margin on this example. So here in this contribution, we have introduced a mechanism, flexible mechanism for the encoding and decoding stages of encode process decode frameworks in order to adhere to the operator learning setting. And we therefore think that it has the potential for real-world applications. As an example, we can see that there has been some alternative designs that have been proposed independently. So the first one is universal physics transformer, which also works with the same spirit. And the second one is latent neural operators. So this means that people are converging more or less with the same kind of solution. And now I'm going to switch to the last contribution of the thesis, which deals with in-context learning for partial differential equations. So as a reminder, here in this setting, we don't want to generalize to new grids, new domains. Here, the task is to generalize to new PDE parameters, which could englobe so PDE coefficients, forcing terms, and boundary types. And here, so you can see that the two viscosities induce really two different behaviors in the dynamics. There are essentially two ways to approach this problem. And so the current approaches, they either assume that the parameters are observed or implicitly learn these parameters from examples. So here I have illustrated this case with the explicit modeling formulation, where in Unisolver, for instance, all the parameters, the boundary types, the PDE coefficients, the domain geometry, etc., all this information is given as input to the model. But this means that when some are missing, or when you cannot model the system with these parameters, it's not possible to use this method. However, it's simple to use at inference, and it is simple to train, provided that you have all the data. And the second framework, so adaptation framework, observe a set of trajectory examples. These trajectory examples are used to infer the corresponding parameters. So this means that they can work without PDE knowledge, so they could infer parameters without observing them. And however, to infer these parameters, they require solving a nervous problem, which requires optimization over some parameters, which means that it is costly at inference. And during training, they are typically trained these methods with a multitask learning or meta-learning objective, which can be complex. And our objective with this last contribution is to propose a framework that picks all these requirements so that can work without PDE knowledge and can have direct inference, and that can benefit from a simple training. And we actually took inspiration from the impressive capabilities of large language models for this contribution. And to illustrate, large language models are actually able to solve tasks using in-context examples. That's what motivated us. So if I prompt my favorite LLM sequence of numbers that start with 1, 2, or 3, that follows the same pattern. And if I ask it to complete the sequence that now starts with a 4, the LLM is actually able somehow to predict the corresponding numbers that follows the correct pattern. And here, this means that the LLM is capable of finding the formulation, the recursive formulation of this sequence, UN plus 1 is equal to 3 UN minus 1. And ideally, we would like here in this contribution to propose something that can take an in-context example that characterizes a certain dynamics, and then that can work and then can complete the sequence for a query of a new initial condition. So here the system should output the prediction such that the trajectory has the same PDE parameters as the in-context example. And so this is a general framework that we have developed with Zebra. And Zebra is able to infer dynamics from context examples and then to generate a trajectory for a new query initial condition. As an illustration here, we have given to the system one example trajectory and a second one. Both of them share the same PDE parameters. We feed these trajectories to a transformer, and we then ask the transformer to generate the trajectory that corresponds to this new initial condition. And this transformer is a generative model that autoregressively generates a sequence of tokens that are then de-tokenized to produce the trajectory. And so large language models actually operate on a discrete space. So they model distributions on a finite vocabulary. And so in order to implement in-context learning in this framework, we have replicated these two stages. So in the first stage, we learn to quantize the state of the trajectories into a finite vocabulary. So this is done with the VQVAE. And in the second step, the LLM training step, we take sequences, tokenize them, and then with this transformer, we predict the next token in the sequence given the previous one. Here in the VQVAE, the encoder also reduces the dimension, which enables us to have a lighter training at this stage. And here in this in-context, we propose an in-context training recipe that samples the trajectories, the two trajectories here in this case, that share the same PDE parameters. For training, we use the parametric setting. So we considered first 7 different data sets. For each data set, we considered different environments, where each environment corresponds to a set of PDE parameters. And then in each environment, we generate trajectories. We generate with the numerical solvers trajectories that have different initial conditions. And so here you can have a look at the PDE parameters that we change to generate this data set. And it is quite exhaustive in a way. So we have the affection speed for the affection equation, diffusion and forcing terms for hidden burgers. Here in Wave, we have tried different boundary conditions, and so on and so forth. And at test time, we take a complex example from a new environment, so that corresponds to a new set of PDE parameters, and we query each model to complete the sequence for a new initial condition. So this is called a one-shot setting. Regarding the baselines, we have used adaptation-based baselines, so CODA and CAPE, which come from the literature. But as they do not rely on the transformer backbone, we have implemented our own vision transformer baseline for this adaptation family. So this means that during training, a class token is learned for each environment, and at inference, this class token, so this CLS token, is adapted to the context example that we provide to the system. There was also no in-context baseline that was able of handling the task that we addressed, and therefore we have implemented a VAT in-context baseline, which is an actual vision transformer adapted to the task. And the transformer is given as input the context example and the query as patch tokens directly. So regarding the results, the first set of results here concerns in-distribution results, where the parameters are taken, the PDE parameters are taken from the same distribution used during training. And we can see that overall Zebra is competitive with the adaptation-based methods, which is already impressive, as these actually optimize an objective at inference, whereas we do not. We only predict the next token. And in particular, so on the 2D data set, we can see that Zebra is able to outperform all the other methods by a large margin. Regarding the out-of-distribution results, so these are more difficult tests. Overall, we can see that all methods suffer from a loss of performance, and particularly it's particularly the case for CAPE and CODA, which diverge quite often in this setting, and which is not the case, for example, for the V18 context baseline and Zebra, which means that potentially this in-context method could be more robust, perhaps in this setting. So overall, we have presented in this thesis 3 main contributions. In the first one, we proposed an operator learning framework with neural fields. In the second one, we tackled the same objective but with transformers. And lastly, with Zebra, we proposed an in-context learning framework for partial differential equations to better handle changes in PhD parameters. These 3 contributions were selected for publications in international conferences. And there are many examples of possible extensions, but here I've selected a few. So for instance, I think that with ARMA, there are still ways to improve the efficiency and the scalability of this kind of methods that rely on cross attentions to encode and decode. And regarding Zebra, I think it could be feasible to bypass the quantization stage that we used, and that it could also be interesting to do an investigation of generative modeling and how they can be used for uncertainty quantification. Well, so now this is the last slide. So I think that overall, over the past 3 years, there has been a lot of progress in surrogate modeling. And I think the recent advancement in weather forecasting exemplify this. However, not applications are equal. So, for instance, with CFD, there is the data is very sparse, and therefore it's still difficult to apply these methods in certain applications. And I think that generalizing out of distributions, as we've seen with Zebra, is always changing. And more recently, there has been a trend of training foundation models across multiple physics, and which could be interesting to analyze and to better understand. And there has been also the release of high-quality datasets such as the whale or driver net. And these datasets are crucial to learn better surrogate models overall. And what remains to explore is the transfer, I think, between different physical applications, and also the transfer to real-world applications overall. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, everyone. Louis, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Maybe we just I don't know what's happening in the south, but if there are people who want to leave, maybe we just give them a few minutes, and then we can start with the questions.
No.
It's all good? Should we start? Things have settled down?
Yeah.
Okay. So then usually it is the tradition in these PhD defenses, we start with the referees. And traditionally, we start with the referee who is further away, has traveled further. So if I'm correct, that should be Alexandros. And if that's all right with you, Alexandros, you can start.
Yes.
Yes. So thank you very much for the presentation. Very clear. Thank you very much for the manuscript. Also quite interesting. I really enjoyed reading it.
Just to check, you hear us, Tarane, when we speak?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
So I had some questions. You kind of answered them now. It was not clear in my head while reading the manuscript, and unfortunately, I didn't have as much time as I wanted to read it carefully, nor the peace of mind. What is actually the difference of zebra with respect to aroma and coral? Reading it, in some moments, I had the impression that it solves kind of an easier problem because it has access to samples from a particular dynamical system. But most probably I'm wrong, and I mean from the presentation today, I kind of understood that coral and aroma solve actually an easier problem. You don't change the parameters of the dynamical system there. Okay, so is it correct?
This is correct.
Okay, okay, good. Now, where should I start? In both coral and aroma, which were the things that I kind of understood better, you are learning a latent representation of the state.
Yeah.
Basically. So you take all your state and you just map it with the help of an INR or a transformer-based INR to this latent representation, and then afterwards you learn how to transition from one latent representation to the other. And I have the feeling that, in a sense, time does not enter in this mapping. So it's just state to next state. There is no explicit time parameter, with the possible exception of the neural OD.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, is what I'm saying correct?
Yes, I think that it's correct. So in coral and aroma, so we chose an autoregressive setting, and therefore we want to model the temporal evolution a bit differently than the spatial functions. And so this means that we mostly consider states after states and encode the states independently of the sequence. We first encode the state independently of the sequence, and then learn the temporal evolution in this latent space. So
in this way of learning, there's not much of a memory, not much of what came before.
No, exactly. There's no memory of the past of the trajectory. Instead, unless with the zebra, which has access to the previous states of the sequence, and even the trajectory of the context examples in this case. But the setting that we considered was the simple mapping UT to UT plus Z.
Okay. Is this well, an assumption that comes from the physics that these systems are kind of Markovian, or
I think that we treated more or less Markovian systems, and we also did this as it was more or less the norm in the literature at the time to design systems like this. But I think that it would be also interesting to have just maybe the temporal coordinates that can play a role at the encoding and decoding phase.
Because I mean, if you think of what we do with NAR, you query it to XY or to some kind of split, to some kind of coordinate system.
Mm-hmm.
Time is just another coordinate.
Yeah, I think it remains an open question to.
I mean, I could
the way
learn
in which we time compared to
I could learn an INR that has just an additional parameter.
Yeah, exactly.
And well, I don't know whether this thing scale or how it would look like, or.
So actually, this means that if you want to perform a forecast with this setting,
You give actually
You give only the first part of the input, and then you try to create directly the rest of the
yes,
sequence.
yes.
So this is not something that we have explored here in these three contributions. There's some contribution with 10 here where we consider actually an iona over the temporal dimension,
Okay.
and we fit only on the first part
Okay.
of the system, and then we try to perform the forecast by going on the later stage of the domain.
Mhm.
So we observed that it would work, so it's definitely an option.
Do you have some kind of intuition on whether it will work better than what you? Because it's a more difficult problem, huh?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to model everything as a single function, so space and time.
Yes.
There are works in videos that actually represent videos with single iona, but they require a lot of optimization. So the optimization time for fitting these ionas is quite significant. So I don't know I haven't really tested, so I don't know what is the simplest approach. I know that it's standard in the computer vision literature to also encode each image separately. So yeah, it could be. It's a good question, I think.
So somehow related to this question, at some parts or at some part in the manuscripts, you talk about compounding error. I'm not sure whether it was the term that you used, but what happens is you go further in time, where we see that the error kind of increases because the uncertainty in the output of the model increases. And in relation to that, I mean, to my mind, it came that this could be also some kind of an artifact because of this state-to-state transition. Modulo what happens with the neural ODE, where there, I guess, you unroll your full trajectory and you want to be correct, and you have an MSC per state, or I'm not sure I am saying that.
This is correct.
Correct. So maybe in the neural ODE you are a bit more robust to this compounding error, but I mean there could have been other modeling choices to go on the dynamics, things like, I don't know, RNNs training, at training time also throwing in some kind of noise in the data so that.
So exactly. So I think that here the settings are, so the setting is the simplest one, I would say. So to enroll the dynamics, you just predict the next state. And we chose this comparison, for instance, in ARMA, as there was a convergence in the literature in using this setting in order to evaluate the more robust architectures and the ones that could scale the more. But regarding your point with the noising, so this is actually something that we do with ARMA. So in ARMA, we train a small denoiser network that's inspired by the method called PD refiner. So this helps to stabilize the rollout of the system over a longer time. But indeed, it's not like it's a method to improve the robustness to the temporal extrapolation, but it's not an objective that we target explicitly in these three contributions. And I think that's also, yes, using something that has some memory of the past could also be used to stabilize the system. And I think that there has been a paper last year that was discussing this. And the more information, the less information that you have at each stage, the more you need memory to compensate for the lack of knowledge.
Okay. Yeah, no, when it's, I didn't take too much notes on the question. So at some point in Aroma, why did you use diffusion?
That's a really good question. Actually, during my first trials with Aroma, I was not able to make the processing work without diffusion in the first attempts. And then I tried, so I came across this this paper PDA refiner. I tried to adapt it, and it worked in the end with this formalism. Afterwards, when we submitted the paper to NeurIPS, we actually did further investigations on the role, and we actually found that it could also work without diffusion for these examples. So it's not mandatory to enroll.
So I mean, the first answer is that it was more difficult to train an MLP like you did with Coral.
It's just a plain transformer that takes a sequence of tokens that predicts the next sequence of tokens. Initially, I think I was not training the system enough in order to be stable over time. And after I had basically found all the hyperparameters that made it work with the diffusion, I came back to it and relaunched the experiment, and it actually.
So the second version was also with the transformer.
Yeah, it's the same architecture. Actually, it's just that one is denoising and the one is just predicting the mean estimation.
Okay. I don't know. Can I continue, or it was?
No, can continue. Huh?
Yes. So maybe some kind of comment on the basic, at least motivation as I saw it, to go from Coral to Aroma, which was this question of locality. So in Coral you compress everything to a vector and everything is mixed up. You don't know what goes on. While in Aroma you really have this somehow structure preservation, should I call it? Yeah. I don't know whether let's see the slides maybe.
This one, makes sense.
Yeah. So the tokens, should I think of them as really going over the grid in some kind of sequential order?
At the left. Here, on the left.
Yes. Yes.
So here, as it is only relying on cross attention here at this stage and not self attention. So each token, when each token attends to a certain region, so for instance, when this token attends to this region, the output of this aggregation step gathers the information from this region. There's no exchange between the tokens at this.
Yeah.
At this
Okay. So here you are much more flexible. I'm not sure whether it's the right.
Could you say again?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about the latent representation that you have here, which is this token-based representation of your initial image.
Yeah.
And how it relates to the more global, you call it in the text, representation that you get from Coral.
Yeah.
If you have Coral with a much larger
Okay, I see.
latent representation, would you be able to match the performance that you get in Aroma?
So actually, what we observe is that by making the Latin code larger, we would obtain better reconstruction. Okay, for the first stage, naturally. But actually, at the MLP stage, the higher the larger the number of channels, the quicker the loss saturates for the MLP. So it's not able to train anymore. It's not even a matter of channelization. It's just that it's not able to train. So perhaps I haven't tried with enough parameters. So there's still
this echoes somehow some observation that people have in learning over latent representations, and then there's this trade-off, learning generated models over latent representations, and there's this trade-off in the reconstruction accuracy, which increases when you have larger latent representations, but then you lose in generation quality, so it kind of feels like a similar, phenomena here. Now, just get also a feeling, I mean, of what is the actual data size that you have here. I mean, what is the instance level? What is a training instance?
So I don't know if I have. So for instance, so in ARMA we have on this data set, I think that we have here 2,000 trajectories.
2,000 trajectories.
About so here it's evaluated with 1,000.
Okay, so let's stay to the 2,000 trajectories. So what is a learning instance in this setting? Because trajectory is not a learning instance. The learning instance is a state.
Yeah. For Coral, yes, that's the
Okay,
case.
so then you have 2,000 times
Times the number of steps of each.
times the number of steps. In fact, you have even more because you are fitting a function, an INR, on each one of the grid points, and you're predicting that.
Yeah.
No.
Yes, and so this means, and this is actually why Dino and Coral failed to these examples, because so we observed also that these are methods that are difficult to scale with dataset size. For instance, if you take one single INR and one image, it's able to represent perfectly, perfectly this signal, but the more and more signals that you give to this modulated neural field, and the less capable it is to actually find a good compromise between everything. And so this is something that we have observed, that in terms of scalability, it was really difficult to make it work on larger datasets. And here we actually have a dataset that are larger than with Coral, which were composed of, I think, 32 or 100 trajectories.
So if I get correctly, you say that if you have more states, INRs kind of reach a plateau.
It's just that it's more difficult to train them, and therefore you saturate their representative power, I would say.
Okay. And so here all the time you work on simulation.
Yes.
So we talked at the end about transfer to real world applications.
Yeah.
Any comments on this gap between what the simulation can produce and what are the data, the real data on which we can actually measure things? So I mean, you trained grosso modo proxies of simulators here. One reason you did that is just because it's much faster, as shown in the beginning, to deploy this system. But also, if we have proxies of simulators, we can go and solve things like inverse problems much faster. But I mean, that means that what we learned is an accurate representation of the reality, what happens in the physical world, which, I mean, it depends on how good your modeling is, but also how accurate the thing that came before, which you based the modeling is, so the simulation. So if there's a gap between reality, I mean, this sim to real story, on the simulator side, your model will reproduce this thing, and we cannot use it for things like solving inverse problems because there is a mismatch between what the simulator can produce and what the real world is producing.
Yeah.
So I mean, this kind of goes to a completely different direction from what you did here. So, any thoughts on?
Well, I guess it would be useful to have, for instance, simulations that have different levels of fidelity to the phenomenon that you would like to describe. Because if you have, for instance, a lot of Browns or LES equations and 1 or 2 DNS of the system, then maybe you could be able to ensure that the surrogate model that you train can recover the.
It's not even about the surrogate model. It's about what comes before.
About
the simulation. So if the simulation, the knowledge of the world very often is not complete.
yeah, it's a model of the.
It's a model of the world. So if the simulator can never produce data that match the real world observations, I mean, we need to find a way to bridge this gap. So what might be ways of bridging the inaccuracies, if you want, of the simulation.
But do you assume that you can have a way to still get data from real observations? Or?
I mean, there's no other way.
Yeah.
You need to get real data. Yes.
Yeah. I think even the weather forecast models, they use reanalysis from other solvers. I think it's a complex.
Yes. But there, I think the models are relatively good models, which is not the case everywhere. And maybe a last question. I mean, I don't take all the time. You kind of set that aside from the beginning of the thesis, or at least when you wrote the manuscript, you said we don't care about high-tech modeling.
I just
So I mean, very good results. We see that the models are accurate. How can we be sure that they capture the right physics, the correct physics, because they are only data driven here. There is no, if you want, actual encoding in like affinity was. In affinity, there was a part of the model was a physics model.
Yes.
And I don't know, in general, in the group, I think this hybrid thing kind of disappeared, or it's So, what's your take on that? I mean, we shouldn't care because we can produce as many data as we want, and that's the way to go. Or there is something that we could get.
No, I think that the hybrid modeling is a sound approach overall. I believe it's not really the hottest topic right now, but there's still really interesting papers that still come regularly. I think that this paper at the beginning, so neural GCM is actually hybrid models. So this one, neural GCM from Google is a hybrid model.
Which one, sorry, there?
Neural GCM. It's a hybrid model that takes a solver of the Earth, and also that is it also learns a PD deep learning component to compensate for
complete.
And here it's particularly useful to learn to replace the hard-coded parameterizations that weather forecasting engineers have been using. So I think it's really useful when you still want to use a solver, but you don't have access to you don't have the budget to dense grid, or you don't really know well the parameters. In this case, the parameterization of a whole dynamic is missing, so it can be useful. But it's true that I think it's difficult to find. I mean, for my case, it was difficult to find ways to improve these models, as there are more or less three main frameworks inside this hybrid modeling scheme. And therefore, yes, I prefer to investigate the neural circuits.
That would be all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. We can move on to the second referee, Amaury.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Patrick and Benoît for inviting me to this jury. And then I'd like to congratulate you, me, the work, because I have done very strong work, very interesting, really good contributions. So I presented the manuscript, the state of the art chapter were very interesting for me because you get a really nice overview of the feeling. It's really good and very interesting to read these chapters, and the contributions are also well presented. See the presentation, it's very wide contributions. It's close to me, and it's congratulations for this. I have some questions, different than one of
Amaury, I'm very sorry to cut you off, but I don't know, Johannes, if you have the same problem. For me, it's cutting a little bit. So if you could just maybe move the micro, because for before it was very good. Maybe if you can just move it a little bit closer to Amaury, it would be good for us. Sorry, it's just to avoid repeating questions.
You are more mobile than the mic.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe it's better like this.
It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, but now it will be easier for me. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I would like to have maybe more feedback on the robustness of your model. And the first task that you wanted to, one of the tasks you wanted to address is the robustness with respect to the discretization, right? With grids. You said, okay, I'm relatively robust to different levels of sparsity, levels of grids. I would like to know if it's possible to characterize when it works when it does not work. Because, for example, if you imagine that at some time you have a distribution of the points which is uniform, sometimes it becomes Gaussian on a particular region. Do you have the same stability? Do you need some same level of sparsity? Do you need some to have a good overview of the state space? Or can you comment on that?
Yeah, this is a really good point. So, does your question tackle Cora or Arma?
First, maybe with the Coral, but if you can comment on Arma,
I don't have any. Okay. So I think that overall, so it's quite challenging to go from a dense grid to a sparse grid, and the inverse is also changing. In Coral, what we have found that would help is that, for instance, if we have several trajectories that were each sparsely discretized, then it could help to recover the dense grid, because it's more or less, as you observe, for instance, on a given trajectory, these points and the other trajectory, these points, then you can sort of fill the gaps between the two, to fill the gap between the two trajectories. But otherwise, I think that because we use this beta learning training here, it's quite difficult to. So here we actually specialize the network to solve the auto decoding task in a few steps. And if you always take all the points, or so if you don't perform some sampling or try to robustify in a way the network, it will degrade the performance at inference. And if you try to optimize very well the district construction objective at auto decoding, more you will have maybe a good output, but then it will be out of distribution for the dynamics modeling, and therefore it's not usable. So in this construction, we always use, for instance, 3 steps for learning and 3 steps at inference, and we stick to that because otherwise we will be out of distribution. We didn't really quantify what could work and what could not, but experimentally, when the level of sparsity is extreme, the model struggles to remove the dynamics. And say that, and I think that also depends on the data that you have, because if you have, for instance, noisy, if you observe an input that is noisy and that is sparsely discretized, so the underlying state is noisy in a sense, then it's almost impossible to recover the correct missing values. I think that in this case, the datasets that we used had, let's say, a high viscosity in a sense, so they had a laminar structure. And I think these experiments will not work on more turbulence.
Okay. And could we say that maybe one important thing is that what you do during training is similar to what you do during inference? It's very close in the sense that you really follow the same steps. Is it very key in your method?
I think this is key because it allows the network to always stays within the same parameter space. You never optimize a step as in Dino for 300 or 500 steps. Therefore, I think that the alignment between the training and the test is actually the reason for using this high meta-learning training strategy. We want to be able to, as we want to solve this auto-dedicated task in 3 steps, we train the model only with 3 steps.
So I have another question, which is maybe related to what you said, but when I read your manuscript, in particular for Coral, you didn't mention regularization. So the only thing you said is that I'm doing only a few steps of gradient descent for training my model.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand. I interpret this as okay. If I do more, I will overfit probably and deviate too much. So we have to control this, but you don't have over regularization. So I was wondering what makes the things working. Is it because you rely on strong initializations and then you know that the physical knowledge is sufficiently encoded in the data and you just have to do a few steps to get the right version and it's okay? Or how do you ensure that you are correctly generalizing?
No, it's a very good question. I think that in Coral, the regularization is not explicit but implicit in 2 ways. So the first way is the modulated Serrano architecture. So here, the parameter space that we explore is quite small. It's only the biset of the network. So this means that the network is, we don't instantiate a full network from this instance-specific code. And then I think that this optimization here that is done in 3 steps is a form of implicit regularization, as you cannot explore the full parameter space in order to solve this objective. Somehow, I think the intuition that I have is that it stays close from this initialization of the parameter that are used at the initialization, and we think that this is the reason why it outperforms Dino on these settings.
Okay, but for ARMA, if I'm correct, you are adding regularization on the latent space code, right?
Yeah, so after this one,
you need to do something more in this model, right?
This one is because we use an encoding network, and here the regularization is required only because we actually compress the channel dimension here. So here, for instance, we could have 128 channels, and then here at this stage we go to 4 or 8 channels in order to facilitate the task of the processor. And what we observed is that directly compressing this channel dimension without any form of regularization leads to an exploding variance in these tokens. So I had variance of like 10, 50, which is not usable for the processor network. So we found a way with the VAE, so with the variational formulation, to somehow put an external objective on these tokens. But I think there could be other alternatives to have a better behaved latent space.
Okay. And is it here if you work in the latent space to unroll the data? Dynamics, it's here? Yes. And so does it play a role in when you try to do your diffusion inference? I mean, the fact that you control really better the latent space?
Yes. So if the tokens have too much variance, then the input first to the transformer it doesn't live in a suitable space, and yes, so we found that adding this penalty, so the scale penalty, helped to model the dynamics. I think we also tried without the KL penalty, and it didn't work as well on this. I think I have a set of the end. So this is a remark. So yes, so this is without, this is a pure auto-encoding actually. So here there is no KL penalty, and it works twice as works the most difficult use case, so it sucks, but it works, still works with, let's say, the simpler examples. So this is not mandatory in a way, but I think that in these two use cases, there was no actually explosion in the variance of the latent tokens. Here we measured that it was actually growing too much.
Okay, thank you. So in aromas, you try to encode the geometry first. So if I'm correct, you do yeah. Okay, you do pre-training to encode the geometry, don't you remember? Or you build it together with the not just maybe I'm mixing with Zebra. With Zebra, you do the pre-training, right?
Yes, we can train.
And so yes, so maybe with Zebra, I was wondering because you pre-train the dictionary. Okay, with Zebra, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe this is key for the task because if you, I mean, my feeling is that if you miss some interesting phenomena in the physical process, you may have an incomplete dictionary, which will be miss some information to really encode our information later. So do we need to have this strong assumption that, okay, what I'm pre-training, I have enough variations of my physical phenomena to be sure to get the right tokens at some point? Or, I mean, do you need this assumption in your model? Or
to form a dictionary?
Yes.
So it's a very good question because initially we removed this quantization stage. So we first trained a model to encode and decode, but then we were sort of blocked because we tried to apply this paradigm of text token prediction and using the same training recipe, and we actually saw that it wasn't able to obtain any forecast even on the train when sampling because here the transformer would be trained deterministically, so it would train to predict the mean estimation of each next token. And in this case, what we found was that it was unstable, so I can maybe show the results. So, for instance, this is the training loss with the next token prediction, but using the LLM formulation. So by using the discrete distribution, and here it's by modeling the mean squared error. It's by using the mean squared error. So when we don't use this quantization stage, and so either the inputs directly of the transformer are not suitable for training this transformer in the next token, either the mean squared error objective doesn't able to correctly predict the dynamics because it saturates really quickly. And this is, for instance, the prediction starting from two initial premisses, the one and the orange one. Even the first prediction in green here has a lot of artifacts because the model after 2, 3, or 5 tokens it starts to go wrong in this setting.
And intervene here, but I mean transformers at the end they mostly operate over discrete representation. So I mean, I'm not sure there's much work that tries to do what we did on the right.
Yeah, exactly. There are works that try to replace the generative components that operates in discrete representations, but with another generative component which uses diffusion. But here it's purely with continuous values, so continuous tokens, and without without a probabilistic component. And I think that transformers can take as inputs but for this task of next token prediction for pre-training, it's not efficient.
So the quantization is key.
The quantization in this framework enables us to leverage like the pipeline of the LLM and therefore to benefit from the same simplicity of training because our model is not that large. And at inference, we observed that it was more stable than this thing here. So I don't think it's key, but it needs to be replaced by something else.
Because I was wondering if it would make sense to add regularization on this dictionary by trying to be sure that it's diverse in some sense. Like, trying to maximize the capacity between codebooks to try to avoid, too much overlap between codebooks just to be sure that you have like a basis that covers your information. So
yeah,
because here you don't really control it. So maybe you may have another information.
So here the only objective to find this codebook is by training to reconstruct actually. So there are ways I think, for instance, on images or on videos to try to find a codebook that is, for example, producing realistic images. So you don't care about representing exactly the same image. You care about producing an image that more or less looks like the input, but that is realistic. So therefore, this kind of architecture, by using the LPIPS loss and so on, it biases this codebook to produce realistic outputs. And I think it's not really transferable, this kind of auxiliary task for the codebook learning in physics, but potentially we could use, for instance, some information about the PD also at this stage. If we had way plate special derivative, the temporal derivatives here, it could be useful. I don't know if it's possible. I haven't really thought about what kind of objective makes sense, but there's definitely a way to influence this codebook to produce something that is, yes, realistic. So basically, could be useful. So could be also thought as a way to produce physically realistic in some sense. And in our case, we used in 1D a small codebook in order to have all the codes to be not to have all the codes in order to use as much code as possible. And in 2D, we simply chose a small channel dimension. But there are other work actually that try to optimize this occupancy of the codebook, and it's interesting.
Okay, and now maybe an open question, but imagine that the physicist tells you that, okay, I'm very interested in modeling this part of the phenomenon because this is very key in the fluid mechanics, this part or this type of geometry, the fact that I have some modulations, some lines or whatever is something I would like to be sure to be able to recover because I think it's really important for my physical modeling. You think you can constrain, or does it make sense to constrain dictionary to be sure to integrate this knowledge in some sense? It's an open question.
That's a very good question. So you mean like learning a dictionary of?
Maybe I don't know if I'm not in this field. So I don't know if in this application that you have maybe it's free dynamics. I don't know if it makes sense or not. But sometimes imagine that the physicist tells you, okay, I really like this to have this turbulent circles. It's very important to model them because I know I would like to recover them correctly because it's really important for understanding the physical phenomena I would like to model, or these lines, or if I have straight lines, it's very important to recover them because it means that maybe like I think if the physics gives you this kind of informations. We imagine to control the dictionary to be able to be sure that we are able to recover this.
I think it's always complicated to impose constraints. So it's a very good question. I don't really know. I know that it's possible, as I said, that you can always impose more constraints to your encoder and decoder. So it's also possible, for instance, to have discriminator network that, for instance, would analyze the reconstruction and make sure that in such zone you would retrieve the important pattern that is important for the field. But it's just something that I did that now, so I don't really know if it's feasible or not. But yeah.
Maybe my last quick question. Okay, you mentioned that lots of things about training, made some difficulties, sometimes you saturate. How do you make things working in practice? I guess it's lots of engineering problems that knowledge that you have on how these models work. So how did you manage to make all the things working? Is it lots of training, testing? Do you, I mean, can you comment, just comment on the difficulty it is?
No, but I think that in all these contributions, every time the steps were more or less clear, and so I think all these contributions have the same pattern, the encode process decode, and so I got more or less used to okay, first I need to have a good encoder decoder, try to analyze it. Of course, reading the literature of the corresponding mode that looked the most to what I was trying to do. And I think that decomposing these steps, so I think that especially for Aroma, for this one, so this was really complicated to make it work. Initially, I had tried to do everything at once, so encode process decode and train all together, but it was more complicated. So for instance, here in the beginning, with the processor network, I first used a regular CNN encoder, use them as tokens, because I know that the CNN encoders are easier to understand, and then I could iterate over this like that. And similarly for the encoder, first I tried to simply aggregate the function values, and then when I tasted on the different CNN, I would say I would think of this geometry encoding because I thought it would make sense to adapt the query tokens here to each geometry. Yeah.
Okay, but I would like just to have your feedback. Thank you very much. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. Then we move on to Johannes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
That's certainly.
Yeah. First of all, thanks a lot, Louis, for this great talk. I hope you're not too exhausted yet. You were talking a lot about recent progress in weather modeling, mentioning projects like GraphCast, Aurora, and so on and so forth, that they basically starting to open a new door in this area and enable a lot of things. So I basically start with the reverse question. What are still opening problems which need to be solved in order that scientific progress can be made?
Sorry, Johannes, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, obviously. So you started with a lot saying or using Aurora and GraphCast as examples of the progress which was made in the last few years, opening a lot of new possibilities. And so I reverse this question and say, what are open challenges which still remain, in your opinion, and which need to be solved in order to make scientific progress in the area of simulations?
Thank you for this question. Well, obviously it's an open question, so we'll try to answer something. Well, so let's take, for instance, the weather forecasting example. I believe that for now, well, it is my understanding that this Aurora and GraphCast model, for instance, take as inputs something that has been produced by reanalysis, so it's not operating directly in real time by taking as observations the sensors that are available at the surface of the Earth. And so I think that overall bypassing the need to produce data with a numerical solver for neural surrogates is a challenging topic. So here, in the case of the weather forecasting example. I know that some people are trying to replace this reanalysis completely with directly something that can be fed observations. So this is one side of the answer, I think. And overall, for scientific applications or engineering applications, I would think that the open challenges that remain would be, for instance, the capacity to handle simulations with many mesh points with a large domain. And potentially, this is where there is maybe even more to gain compared to miniature solvers, as they struggle with this setting. And yes, maybe if I have more time after, I can give you a more thoughtful answer.
No, these were great question, great answers. I want to ping you a bit more and ask a guess. So maybe you know, but if you look at Aurora on GraphCast and basically that we get an idea of the scale these projects we're doing. Do you know that the size in terms of bytes, one of these models has to digest for input outputs? So what's the size, like the engineering challenge to get a data point on the GPU? You have an idea?
I don't know the resolution of the input. Maybe one single input, so one single frame, maybe 1 GB or something, and maybe it's 10.
Yeah, it's in the order of 1 to 10 gigabyte exactly. This is one frame, so just to okay, and basically going in this direction, you mentioned two data sets, which I find extremely interesting, DriverNet and Vel. Do you know, I mean, those are new data sets coming up. They very different in what they present. Both of them are super interesting and everyone is quite excited about. Can you conceptually describe them and basically show the differences and what challenges they bring if you look at those future challenges?
Yes, for sure. So I don't know all the details, but I know that the well is constituted by a series of datasets which are of high interest to physicists. So it can include really complex problems. I don't have the names of the datasets right now, but I know that it's large-scale simulation, but on regular domains.
Yes, regular domains.
And they typically include a variation in parameters, but mainly I would say in the initial states, if I'm not correct, if I'm not wrong. And regarding the driver net, I think it's so yes, geometry is it includes the geometry of a car. I think so. It's a car object with a certain mesh, and I don't remember if it's the Round's equation or the LS equation that is the corresponding output. But yes, so it's irregular mesh with about 1 million or 2 million, I think, nodes, if I remember.
There's another big difference relating to your methods. If you look at DriverNet, there's also DriveML, I think. What are these like in terms of temporal modeling? How they are these like time series or?
I haven't really looked at the modeling of DriverNet. I looked only at the datasets.
No, it's basically just the start of the question. So those are not time series. The well is like a time series, and these huge data sets, these huge problems are static problems. Yeah.
Yeah. Static.
That is basically, so these are the two classes of open problems I see. So these huge static problems and then this time series, as you said, but they are on regular domains and so on and so forth. Okay. And now coming a bit to your methods. So I like Aroma a lot, obviously, because I think a lot of people had, well, not a lot, but a few people had similar ideas. I mean, they make a lot of sense. Can you maybe motivate what was your intrinsic thinking of designing Aroma?
Yes, of course. I think that the main intuition that I had for designing Aroma was when I looked at all these generative models that worked for images or videos that always had this encode and then generating phase and then decode. Because this encoding and decoding lets you operate in a latent space that is reduced, and therefore it's feasible to actually learn the generation in the latent space. And so I wanted to have, yes, this encoder and decoder that somehow could be used to produce a sequence of tokens. But my thought process in doing so was to remove all the convolution as much as possible, removing them all. And so the question that I had in mind is how to go from a set of endpoints to the sequence of tokens, as I still want to use the transformer for modeling the time stepping or the output of my system. So this was more or less the idea. And then, of course, I think it's not mentioned here, but this is inspired by the Perceiver architecture, specifically Perceiver IO, which is a general architecture that takes yes, a sequence of tokens that can output a sequence of tokens, and that was proposed for text and images.
Very nice. So obviously, looking at computer vision seems like a very good choice because they figured things out, and basically the hard task is to apply into scientific problems. So if we go a step further, what people in computer vision have, I think, managed in the last 2 years. I mean, there's different opinion, but I'm now very drastic and say they managed to do video modeling very well. How would you translate that to physics systems? So what would be the challenge of Aroma to update it, so to say, to build an Aroma++ which works for videos, or which produces, to be more concrete now, correct physics-wise time series simulations? Or would you still do it autoregressively, given what you now know?
Yes, okay, so it's a very good point. So it is true that so now there are ways to encode a series of frames and to decode them to better compress and to better represent the dynamics of videos. And so now I think that the state of the art in video is not autoregressive, but generates full videos in parallel by using the whole sequence. Actually, I think this is something that someone in our team has tried, not with the specific Aroma design, but with the generic encoding and decoding scheme. And I think that it works quite well. Yeah, so that's maybe my answer.
And so that means you basically need like time series as input, or how would you?
No, I mean, to generate a video, you could do something like this. For instance, you have a latent refiner, so let's say a transformer that predicts that models the distribution of several tokens, and it's not obliged here to have a single token as a prediction. You can also stack a bunch of latent tokens. So we could stack a whole frame, a whole trajectory, and then yes, we could generate a whole trajectory in parallel, not necessarily autoregressively. I think that it has maybe the potential to eliminate the error accumulation that is usually observed in autoregressive setting.
You said something very interesting. So generate the whole trajectory. There is this new trend and I mean, there's like many startups appearing in the US in the LLM sector. So they built diffusion LLMs. Do you know what the diffusion LLM is doing and what's the conceptual difference to standard LLMs and how this relates to what you're saying?
So at inference, diffusion LLM, I believe, paths to the right the input that it wants to generate. So there are placeholders with some noise tokens. I don't know if they are discrete or not, but what the diffusion LLM is capable of doing is to iteratively in parallel over the whole sequence generate tokens. And so this means that, for instance, with the recent Gemini diffusion Gemini, we have seen that these are systems that are capable of generating a whole page in parallel instantaneously. So it's much faster at inference. And during training, I don't know the details, but
I don't know the details either. But the interesting part is it generates this text or this whatever in parallel, and then it iteratively refines, right? And this is a concept we see now in videos, we see in language. And you said you can do the same thing in physics systems in latent space, right? Does this make sense in physics system if we generate the whole simulation and then look over it again, or?
I think it depends on what you are interested to have. If you just want a system that's able to perform a forecast over a certain horizon and that's it, then I think it makes sense as long as it works. But maybe you would like to go beyond this given horizon, and perhaps it is maybe less prone to generalize in the setting. I am not so sure, but yeah, this remains to be investigated. I think.
No, I fully agree. Yeah, and then maybe last thing on this slide, you mentioned diffusion, and basically diffusion is a way of modeling autoregressive of basically different modeling stuff. There is what is very interesting in the whole area. People started to interpret diffusion in many different ways. One of this interpretation is as a spectral refining method, where you basically, and you presented PD refiner. Do you know other ways of how you can interpret, use diffusion in physical systems?
Think a bit. So specifically for physical systems, or
Big
or in general?
relative, it doesn't have to be a specifically physics system. Yeah.
Well, overall diffusion is a way to map to distribution, so maybe there's an interpretation in the optimal transport diffusion, but here related to physics, it's true that I had in mind your explanation about the spectral components that are learned and refined in the PD refined paper. So I don't know.
Let's do one example. So let's say you have a system with a bifurcation, right? So a system where at some point in time you get either state A or state B. If you do that with a deterministic model, would you be able to capture this bifurcation correctly?
Well, maybe you would predict only the mean of the two perturbations. I think you would a less plausible, less physically plausible output, because you could not take one or the other bifurcation, but you would only represent the mean in some way.
And would a diffusion model be able to capture that? If it's well trained and you have enough data and whatnot.
I think it could, but I am not 100% sure. But I think that in the Kuromoto-Shimashitsky equation, there are bifurcations, and that that PD definer on this specific equation was actually able, if I remember, to handle these cases. So yes, if I'm not correct, if I'm not wrong.
No, it's an open question, but I mean it's interesting that these modeling schemes arise where you basically use generative modelings to try to capture phenomena which we cannot model with a standard deterministic setting, although these systems are kind of deterministic. Yeah, and I like this a lot on the slides. Maybe coming to your last contribution, I wasn't even aware that there's an SML paper. So the zebra, or I'm not so sure how you pronounce it. This is a very interesting idea. So basically in context learning for for PDEs. So as I understood correctly, you need to provide a few trajectories. Is this correct as a basic context?
Yes, exactly. So the way that we prompt the model reflects the way it is trained. And for training, we usually sampled between 1 or 5 trajectories in these examples. And then at inference, the testing was with the one-shot setting. So we give one context example and one initial condition, and ask to complete the trajectory.
So you need to, thanks for the explanation. So you need to provide these trajectories. But what happens if we go now to 3D settings and then you basically need to provide a few of these 3D trajectories, right? How would you do that?
This, this is a good question because actually one of the main drawbacks of this design is that it requires a sequence of tokens that can be very long. So if we stack, for instance, 5 trajectories with 256 tokens with 10 frames per trajectory, it makes about 8,000 tokens for training. So if we multiply this by the dimension in 3D, I think it would not be feasible. But I believe that one way to actually maybe consider this use case is by first splitting an encoder for the specific context example, and then the decoder that could be a diffusion model or large language model for the generative components. And yes, I think there could be ways to improve the scalability to 3D, but 3D in general is really complicated to scale. And yes, I think that this method would require some adjustment to work in 3D.
How far you think you can compress such a sequence? So let's say we have a three-dimensional Navier-Stokes equation. How strongly can you compress such an equation? Because I mean that would be the door opener to make that feasible, right?
Yes, you would like to compress it. To be honest, I have never looked at 3D Navier-Stokes equations in the eye, so I'm not so sure of how turbulent it can be. What is true is that in general, here with Zebra, when we lowered the viscosity, so when we had a more turbulent regime, the reconstruction was worsening. And it all depends on the level of, I think, of approximation that you want from your neural solid. If you are okay with maybe a 1 or 2 or 3% error, then it could be feasible to compress it by 2, by 4, I'm guessing here. But I don't know if it would be enough for the system to work like this. Here we compress actually by 4 on the vorticity in this example, and so that's it.
Yeah, yeah, I think I agree. The final question, you presented a lot of equations and a lot of systems, which you looked at during your PhD. What's your favorite PDE?
I don't know. I've worked a lot on Berger's equation because Coral was not working well on this one, so I would pick this one, I think, because also it has a shock at the end.
So what makes the Berger's equation special?
Well, you have a shock at the system evolves at the end of the equation of the trajectory, and yes, you can show analytically that they can be to say it singular points within the solution. So there is a particular point where the system has an infinite spatial derivative, and so it's using.
Do you know the bigger brother of the Berger's equation?
I know. I think it's your favorite equation. So the Quadratic-de-Vries equation, right?
That's more like a cousin. But the brother is the Navier-Stokes equation, right? It also has this convective term and the diffusive term, just the pressure gradient and in more dimensions. but it's basically Burger's equation is basically Navier-Stokes equation in 1D,
Mhm.
or the Euler equation 1D. Okay, yeah, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. I think there are just a few questions that are left for me, so I don't take too much of your time, Louis. But I think out of everyone in your jury, I'm the one with a little bit of a different background. So I'm mostly applied math and mechanics, especially fluid mechanics. So my questions might be a little bit more from a different domain, okay? So we are going to do a very dangerous exercise here, and we're going to see if the two communities actually do meet or not. So if my questions are not clear, please tell me and I will reformulate, okay? Coming from a little bit of, let's say, more applied world, I had sort of a more general question that applies both to coral and aroma. When you talk about, and it sort of connects a little bit with the question that Amory also had. So when you're talking about coarse or sparse samples, okay? First of all, the question is both for tokens and samples. When you pick your random samples or random tokens during the training process, are they kept fixed or can they change?
That's a very good question. So in the main experiments of Coral, we fixed the grid for training. We sampled the grid out of the test grid, fixed it for all the trajectories for training, and at this time we sampled a different grid
And
with the same level of sparsity.
sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
So this is the setting for the main experiments.
And this is for both for coral and aroma. So the tokens in aroma are also fixed, right?
So in aroma, the tokens are always fixed. So the tokens they live in this n times h space, and the observations depends on the data set. So we had experiments with regular grids where here the grids are not touched, they are kept fixed. On the right here, the grids are irregular, but they are kept fixed. And there is a table, two missing here, but where we also have done the same experiments as in Coral, which are with one grid for training and one grid for testing.
I see. But then during the training, the grids, none of the trajectories always come from the fixed grids.
So
right?
we don't alter the grid after that. I think that in Coral, I also subsampled some points to increase the robustness during training. So it means that we produce a given grid that is the same for training, and then out of this given grid, further subsamplings are applied. Yeah, but that's overall.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason, let me at least explain to you the reason why I'm asking this is that, of course, in simulations and in numerics, things can be very controlled, right? But when we go to real world, unfortunately, in the domain that I'm from, which is the fluid mechanics, simulations are usually very costly. And when we go to parametric things, there are mostly experiments that are available, right? And then when you go to experiments, unfortunately, when you're gathering data, spatial temporal data, both in space and in time, there might be possibilities that the sensors fail. So that means that you are not going to have the grid that is fixed in a way, in that sense. You're going to have spatial samples or sensors that suddenly fail, or in time they suddenly don't predict. So I was wondering if there is a case or if there is a possibility to extend these type of frameworks to those sort of situations.
Yes, exactly. This is a good question. We can definitely see a way of training these models by having different grids which could correspond to the available sensors at a given time. I think these sensors could also evolve over time. There is nothing that blocks in the modeling. So overall, as we do the things specially, as we do the encoding specially, we can encode any point set with these two frameworks in the Latin space, and the choice of the grid will have an impact on the results, but it is compatible at least with these frameworks.
Okay, because that would have quite a bit of an impact in our community, at least. You see. And then another question that I had, and this was just I went through the thesis as well. It's maybe in the way we use Latin space is maybe a little bit different. So I just need a little bit of an explanation of when you do, for example, in the choral, when you talk about encoder, what is being encoded? So what is the information? Yeah. So if you say, for example, if I have a spatial, if I have a few sensors, spatial data, what are you encoding exactly? Are you going from random points to a special fixed points in the domain, or no? That is not what you're doing.
So the end of this auto decoding stage. So initially we initialize the code to 0. It's a certain number of channels. There's no special dimensions here involved. So it's a vector of size 64, let's say. And then we optimize this objective in order to minimize the L2 error between the neural fields output and the set of observations. And it's a bit complicated to understand what's being encoded, as there is also the set of weights theta that come into play when reconstructing the output. But these instance-specific codes are in this framework called the encoding of this function to this mechanism.
Okay, got it. Okay. And then another question, and maybe you don't have an answer for this, which is perfectly okay. The question is, usually, for example, when we deal with data or experimental data, the sensors that we get are actually quite sparse, right? So I was wondering, is there have you tried to see how far you can push these algorithms, how sparse really in the observational space you can go? Although I understand that depends on the dynamics or the system, but how sparse would it go actually if you push it?
So we have ourselves tried as far as 5%, but on an initial condition. I know that there are works that have tried to go up to 1% of the states that are available, but because they consider a longer horizon in order to aggregate in order to better understand the dynamics, I would say. So I think this would be my answer. If you have a really sparse input, but measured over time, this could be used to compensate for this lack of spatial knowledge. And yes, that's the
okay. Okay, and then maybe one question on aroma. When you were you talk about these tokens that are in the sort of they have some sort of attention in the spatial domain, in space, right? So does that mean, am I understanding this correctly, that if I don't have a special support for my data, if these sensors are just completely localized, I won't be able to use this architecture?
I think that here what is being represented here is simply the cross attention scores between this query Q. I don't know if you can see the.
No, but I can guess.
I can show with the.
That's better. Yeah.
Sorry, I can start again. So this is the cross attention score between these query tokens, and here the keys that are formed by positional embedding of the coordinates. So this means that here for the illustration, we have simply selected a given token, so let's say T1, then computed the attention scores for each of these query coordinates, but nothing prevents us from querying more coordinates than within this grid, and have simply like a denser attention map. I don't know if that replies, if that answers the question.
I see. Yeah, no, that answers the question. Yeah. And maybe one last question, and that also goes with sort of a real world data that you have that we get. Usually with the data that we have to process, they are quite noisy. So I was wondering if I saw something about UQ or noise in the thesis. Could you comment on that? How would affect the performance of these models?
How noise would affect
Yeah. So if, for example, my data that I'm giving is not clean, and it has it has a little bit of noise that is inside.
Yeah, I think that in such cases, it would be standard to use a stochastic approach for handling this noisy input. Because the noise that is injected in the solution or in the input means that there is uncertainty, I would say, in the output. So in order to be able to produce different outputs given this noisy input, I would use preferably a stochastic component, so a generative model. So in a way, here in Zebra, we refine the tokens at the processing stage, but we would also need to model perhaps at the auto decoding phase to model the amount of noise that we have in order to produce here a latent token that is that takes into account this amount of noise. So for instance, for regularizing this architecture, we only apply a KL term to regularize the space on this latent token, but we could also use, for instance, in the reconstruction here, not only an MSC objective, but something that can also leverages the uncertainty. If the noise uncertainty is known, then we can directly apply this, and otherwise we can learn the noise distribution.
I see. And maybe just last comment, because relates to what Johannes was asking, is that what would be these diffusion transformers or diffusion models would be able to do. I think it would be quite relevant into modeling turbulent flows. Because in a way, at least in fluid mechanics, the way we do it traditionally is that we either filter the equations, or we do something with the equations, and then we define a source term, which is really quite stochastic. Is really a stochastic forcing that comes on the right-hand side of the equation. And I think the diffusion models would be actually, I would personally think they would have quite an impact for modeling sort of stochastic PDEs. Okay, I think at this point I'm done. Now, I don't know in computer science if you do that as well, but at least in our community, before going to the supervisors, I ask the people in the room who have a PhD degree whether they have any questions for Louis, but only those with a PhD degree are allowed to ask a question. So I don't see anybody with hands. If there is anyone, Louis, you're allowed to take their questions.
Thank you.
No.
No one?
No one.
Okay, then I think we will then move on to the supervisors.
So
don't have any questions. So I'm only making some contextual remarks. So I first met you when you started working nearby my office back in the days of the fifth floor of Tower 26. And from the beginning, it was clear how you quickly got involved, diving into the work, talking to the PhD students who were finishing their PhD at that time, and working with them and really make the subject your. So that's this first collaboration led to one of your contributions, Infinity, that is described in the manuscript, but you didn't present it today. I always been impressed not only by your technical skills, but also with your ability to bring new ideas, develop them, and more importantly, make them work. Because it's not in this field, it's not so easy. So from your early work oral and aromatic refinement, and also the very innovative contribution with Debra when you took inspiration from her. So I'd like to say that when you moved to the pyramid, it was for me it was a bit complicated. So because we are no longer in the same place, but I saw how you kept taking an important role in the team, so welcoming a new PhD student, working with them, involving them in your works, so we could give you some feedback, and also took confidence and making their ideas and contributions. So very valuable. I also like to say that I truly learned a lot following your work, and I want to thank you for that. So congratulations again for this excellent thesis, and both for the scientific results and also for the path you have taken. That shows really great human skills. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So I will say a few words also, but more or less the same thing as you know. So during your thesis, I asked many questions, trying to figure out what you are doing exactly, and to understand, for me, relatively complex models and architectures you were using. Okay? But at the time, it was just to figure out a few days later that I missed coming back to you. Okay, that being said, I would like to congratulate you on all the work you did, and for me it was also a real pleasure to see you. And I would like also, Jean-Noël, to thank you really about the energy you brought to the team, and for coming with so many innovative and new ideas, and maybe most of all sharing them with your fellow PhD students. I think it has been beneficial for everybody. Okay? And it has really created a strong dynamics. So thanks for all. And I would also like to highlight that okay, so you are presenting the three contributions, but you're also been working with fellow PhD students on other topics that also led to publications in selective. Also, that's it for me, and thanks again, and wish you the best for the future. Okay.
Thank you, Patrick. I think this terminates our open session. I think the jury will then retreat for deliberations. Patrick, will you send us another? What should we do? Should we log into another link?
No, I think you keep this link. Okay. We will cut the YouTube link. You know how to do that? And we here, we will move to another room, okay?
Yeah.
So you stay on the Zoom link. Okay?
Yeah.
And we'll join you.
Okay. So we
Well,
stay on the Zoom link, and then you will join us. Just maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Sure.
Just
And then we need to move from
Yeah.
this room to another room.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, and see you soon.
You sit here.
Let me check everything.
Pas trop longtemps, parce que-
Ouais. Normalement, faudra déconnecter cet ordi du Zoom. Ah, ça va. Sinon, on va se connecter. On embarque celui-là?
Oui, c'est celui-ci.
Ok, on embarque.
C'est le nom de quelqu'un. C'est pour nous.
Je suis désolé,